Eliza Carter was 30 years old and ran a modest fabric and yarn shop just steps from the historic waterfront in Cape May, New Jersey, where salty breezes carried echoes of ships and distant horizons, and she opened her front window each morning hoping the sea might send news she had long since ceased expecting, because her husband, Thomas Walker, a sailor with the United States Merchant Marine, was declared missing in 1943 when his convoy was torpedoed off the coast of the Canary Islands during World War II, and no body was ever recovered. Only his final letter, promising, "I'll come home when the sea settles," remained as her fragile anchor in a sea of uncertainty. For years, Eliza preserved that single letter in a small wooden box in the back room, wrapped in linen scraps, scented faintly of ink and longing, and the townsfolk murmured that she was brave, even stubborn, resisting offers of new suitors and quietly refusing to close that chapter of her life, because in her mind, Thomas still sailed toward her shore, even as she watched empty docks and quiet Vez. One August afternoon in 1954, with the midday seagulls calling overhead and a briny breeze drifting through the open shop window, 3 soft knocks echoed against the glass. Eliza froze at her cutting table. There, framed in the narrow window pane, stood a man with weathered features, graying beard, and eyes that mirrored recognition and disbelief, and in that instant, time seemed suspended. The scissors slipped from her hand and clattered to the wooden floor. He opened the door with tentative strength. He was Thomas Walker, older, gaunt, but unmistakable. He looked at her and whispered, voice cracked and full of remorse, "I thought I'd missed my chance." Those words swirled like distant tides, irreversibly bridging past grief and present reality. Words swept through Cape May like a sudden storm. The lost sailor came back. Curious neighbors peered from the sidewalk. The harbor workers paused their midday routines. Eliza guided him into the shop and showed him the rear room that had served only to store bolts of cloth. She offered that modest space to him, at least for tonight. The penny-wax lamp cast long shadows against rolls of fabric, while outside the harbor gulls cried and salt air drifted in. That night she could not sleep. She listened to his footsteps in the hall and watched the back door lock. The sea had returned a ghost, and the promise she once thought dead knocked quietly on her shop window. The return was no dramatic reunion. It was a fragile threshold where memory touched possibility. She did not yet know what questions to ask, what wounds to reopen, what fears she might face. She only sensed that something long dormant stirred again, neither comfort nor pain, but a fragile, trembling hope. If this story has touched you as deeply as it touched me while writing it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. That helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, prepare yourself, because what follows will change everything. Eliza could not sleep the first night he arrived. She lay awake listening to the faint sound of Thomas's footsteps in the narrow hallway behind the shop, each soft echo reminding her of Longago sea shanties and distant voyages that ended in absence and unanswered prayers. At dawn, when pale sunlight filtered through the stained glass transom above the door, she rose and made 2 cups of black coffee, their steam curling like memories, and placed them on the counter. She glanced toward the rear room, expecting Thomas to appear, and he did, slowly emerging from the dim back space, wearing an old wool sweater and faded trousers, looking older, thinner, but undeniably him, his eyes steady, haunted by oceans crossed and years lost. And when he saw the steaming cup and met her eyes, he murmured quietly, "Thank you for letting me stay." She nodded without speaking. Words had not yet found their way back into their lives. Outside, the morning seemed normal. The newspaper boy called out headlines, fishermen dragged nets from the boats, gulls wheeled overhead. But inside that small, cluttered shop, time bent and memories blurred. Customers arrived to browse fabrics or ask about ribbon, but whenever the bell jingled, both Eliza and Thomas paused. She pretended to adjust bolts of cloth while he rearranged yarns on a shelf, careful in each gesture as though learning to belong again. By midday, word had spread along Beach Avenue and down to the lighthouse. Thomas Walker, declared lost over a decade earlier, had walked in. Neighbors drifted by the window, eyebrows raised, asking under their breath if this could really be him. Still, Eliza carried on as if everything were routine. She clasped her husband's old letter to her heart, the one that began, "I'll come home when the sea settles." Although she had kept it safe for years, she never touched it in his presence. The return letter would need to be his own. Late afternoon came, and they moved to the rear room for tea. It was cramped and smelled faintly of burlap and salt air, but the walls held years of silent power. This was the space where she had stored hope. Thomas sat at the tiny folding table, tracing the grain with a slow finger. Eliza poured strong tea and set 2 mugs between them. "I thought I was dead," he said finally, voice low and trembling, "or that you would learn to forget me." His words broke the quiet. She looked at him, remembering the man she believed lost, recalling his laugh that once filled the harbor tavern, the promise in his voice when he said he would return. "You never said if you tried," she replied, voice hoarse. She felt the rush of anger and tenderness collide. He nodded slowly. "I did try. Years later, that is. But without papers, without proof, who would believe a stranger washed ashore in West Africa claimed to be Thomas Walker of Cape May?" He looked away, his breath catching. "I was ashamed. I thought no one would want me back." Eliza's hand trembled. She wanted to shout that he had always belonged, that she waited for that moment every sunrise, but she settled for steadying his hand with hers. Silence followed, not empty, but full of years, of unasked questions, of grief turned into fiber and fabric waiting to be rewoven. The following day, Thomas helped her in the shop. He learned to thread the sewing machine and unroll wool with gentle care. He listened when customers asked about shutters or upholstery, offering quiet words, helping carry heavy bolts. Every small task felt like a vow, each deliberate motion a step toward belonging. Eliza watched him from behind the counter, her heart unsettled, because though she saw someone who knew the routine, she also saw a man who had crossed an ocean of fear to stand here now. That evening, they went for a walk along the boardwalk. The sky was pink and orange, and the salt wind smelled of nostalgia. People in light jackets strolled past, couples arm in arm. Eliza and Thomas walked side by side, shoulders nearly touching. She asked, "Do you remember spending 4th of July fireworks on the pier?" He nodded. Distant, "I do. You looked up at the sky and told me every star was a promise." "I forgot for a long time," he admitted. "But that moment, that promise, it became a memory that found me again." She took a deep breath. "I kept your letter, tucked it in its box. I thought it was my only way to talk to you." He paused, turned to her, holding her gaze. "Maybe now I'll write to you," he said softly. "A proper letter." Her eyes glistened. That night she slept, finally, feeling the weight of absence lift slightly under the horizon of their conversation. In the days that followed, the shop settled into a new rhythm. Thomas settled into the rear room and began sorting through his few belongings. A battered sea chest with travel trinkets, a letter from the hospital in Dakar placed beside it. He carefully placed the chest on the lower shelf of a cabinet next to the box, holding her unopened letters. The collection was silent and tentative, hers and his fragments side by side. When customers asked if renovations were intended, she simply replied, "Just making space." He nodded, understanding. Memory needed room, but it also needed silence. Occasionally, his sister, Clara, came to visit from Philadelphia. She greeted Eliza with cautious kindness and watched Thomas observe customers help themselves to ribbon and ribbons, measuring wool yards. She said to her brother later, quietly, "You didn't belong to them until you showed you belonged." He looked at her, and she smiled faintly, though tension lingered in the line of her jaw. 2 weeks in, Thomas brought out a stack of dusty, handwritten letters on sepia paper, tied with ribbon. They were his attempts to explain what happened after he disappeared. Letters dated years earlier, yet undelivered until now. He slipped the stack into Eliza's hand. She unfolded the top sheet and read aloud, voice wavering. "I feared you would mourn me forever, and I had no right to disturb that peace." Tears formed in her eyes. She swallowed, looking at him, no questions needed. Thomas helped with the evening closing now. He flipped the sign to closed, turned the lights off one by one, and stood beside her as she locked the door. They walked home along the quiet street beneath gas-lit lamps, guided by hush and salt air. When they reached their house nearby, he paused and said, "Thank you for believing in my return." She smiled, reaching for his hand in the dim light. They stepped inside together, not as strangers reunited, but as threads knitting back into the tapestry of their past. That afternoon, a late August sky hung low and heavy above Cape May, grey clouds rolling in from the Delaware Bay, and inside the shop's rear room, Thomas Walker began to tell the story of what happened after the convoy was attacked, while Eliza sat across from him, her fingers tracing the edge of an old photograph propped against a spool of thread. He spoke with slow deliberation. His voice, hushed and steady, carried weight. "After the ship went down, I was picked up by a fishing boat off the coast of West Africa." Eliza listened, silent, as the words formed a bridge between absence and return. He described waking on a wooden deck, waves slapping the hull, the boat rocking gently under a starless sky. For days, he had no memory of his name, no papers, no identity, until a nurse who spoke broken English offered him water and showed him a photograph of Cape May, asking where it was. That photo stared back at him like a lifeline. "I clung to it," he said quietly. "It reminded me who I was." Eliza's throat tightened. She had kept that very photograph in a frame next to her cutting table. Now it rested between them. He continued. "They fed me, clothed me, sorted my wounds. I stayed on that boat longer than I thought possible because I didn't dare try home without proof." His confession hung in the air. Outside, the sound of wind chimes and the distant cry of gulls drifted in from the street. He paused, inhaled deeply. "It wasn't shame that kept me away," he added. "It was fear. Fear you might have moved on. Fear the sea had taken everything already." Eliza looked away, her breathing shallow. She held back the urge to say he belonged. Instead, she asked softly, "Why come now?" His gaze met hers. "Because when I heard your name read on a broadcast back home, someone mentioned Cape May and your name, I felt my heart want to walk through that door." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She whispered, "I never stopped hoping." He offered a small, fragile smile. "If you'll let me, I want to rebuild." She reached for his hand. Their fingers bridged years. Over the next days, during quiet hours between customers, Thomas unpacked a battered trunk filled with small treasures from distant ports. Seashells, a faded postcard painted by a child in Dakar, a metal compass etched with initials he recognized as his own. One item at a time, he placed them in neat rows on a shelf beside Eliza's letterbox. Each object was a statement of presence, a fragment of the life he had lived during those missing years. Neighbors began whispering again. Some admired his determination. Others questioned whether it was delusion. But day by day he worked, helping with the cash register, repairing a loose floorboard, sweeping the porch. When he handed Eliza a freshly sewn curtain for her shop window, she realized those daily acts, each so small, were his way of saying he was home. One late afternoon, Clara, Thomas's sister visiting from Philadelphia, arrived unannounced. She stood in the doorway watching quietly as her brother measured fabric for a customer. After a moment, she approached Eliza. "I see now that you haven't lost him," she said softly. Eliza nodded. Clara turned to embrace her brother and his shoulders loosened. Even Helene, Eliza's longtime friend, later admitted she felt guilt for doubting a man who had weathered both war and memory. A week later, Thomas suggested they walk the Colonial Promenade before closing time. Together, they strolled past Victorian beach houses, the sea breeze tousling their hair. He spoke of the nights at sea and the days spent learning new languages among strangers who had shown him compassion. She mentioned how she had kept his letters, stamped and sealed, and how she never opened them until now. When they arrived at the spot near the lighthouse, where the spray tossed across the stones, he paused. From his jacket he pulled a folded letter, written on parchment-like paper, and placed it in her hand. "I wrote this when I didn't know if I'd ever return," he said. She opened it and read aloud. "I was afraid the sea had taken you, and I couldn't bring myself to disturb your peace." Her voice trembled. He stepped closer. "I'm here now," he said softly, "and if you'll have me, that quiet makes sense again." That evening, as thunder rolled over the bay, they sat in the back room drinking coffee by lamplight. She looked at him and asked, "What do you need now?" He paused, thoughtful. To belong to this town again, to this shop, to you." She leaned forward, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "You are already," she replied. In the days that followed, they set simple routines. Breakfast at the window before the rush, side by side folding fabric, walking the dunes after work, writing letters side by side at the rear desk. No grand declarations, no promises of forever, but a steady presence that said what words could not. One evening, Eliza placed a slender note between bolts of cloth for a customer to find. "Thank you for coming home." Soon, she discovered another behind the counter, in Thomas's handwriting. "Every day is a new chance to stand together." These small messages became quiet affirmations when spoken feels too loud. Neighbors stopped asking about missing sailor tales. Instead, they asked about fabric colors, new patterns, upcoming holiday sales. Thomas answered patiently. When someone commented how different the shop felt, Eliza realized she felt it too. Something had settled. A calm after years of suspense. Some nights, they would sit on the porch steps, listening to hushed waves. He'd say, "I thought I'd never know peace again," and she'd reply, "But peace found us anyway." And there, beside the harbor glow and whispering tide, they found something unspoken, that love once paused, when returned, can still become something whole. No dramatic reunion, only two lives quietly interweaving in a place shaped by sea and memory. And though the scars remain, the horizon now holds not sorrow, but a certain hope, grounded in ordinary days, quiet devotion, and shared courage. As summer shifted into early fall, the air in Cape May carried a crisp edge that foretold changing tides, and inside the shop toward midday, Eliza and Thomas settled into a rhythm of shared silence and occasional conversation as he began answering the persistent questions she had long carried in her heart. She watched him unpack a worn box of letters he had written during his years adrift, each page yellowed and fragile, and he described in careful detail how he gradually pieced together his identity after the wreck. Waking in a small village in West Africa, learning to speak just enough English, helping haul nets, assisting with repairs on the fishing boat that had saved him. While nightly he traced the shape of her hometown in his mind from a faded map, determined to find his way back. He spoke of the profound isolation when he realized he had no papers, no proof of citizenship, and that he existed as a nobody stranded on foreign sands. He recounted nights when he feared death more than living without recognition, when every breath felt borrowed and he would stare across wide oceans in dreams, wondering if the quiet of his absence reverberated at home, whether she had learned to let go, or whether she still believed that one day he might knock at her window. Eliza listened, her hand hovering over a stack of her own letters, unsent expressions of longing, paragraphs of hope and memory. that she had tucked away in a trunk beneath the floorboards, not daring to open them until now, because she feared what she might read about sorrow or regret. She inhaled the faint scent of salt from the open window and held her breath as he described hearing a radio broadcast in Dakar, someone mentioning Cape May, someone mentioning Eliza Carter, and how her name had carried across the static into his broken heart, sparking recognition so strong that he felt compelled to begin the journey north, even with uncertainty at every port. His tone softened when he spoke of the day he finally set out on a small freighter heading toward Europe, traveling anonymously, working in engine holds, enduring storms, and saving every cent until he bought a simple ticket that landed him in New York Harbor. He spoke of bus rides, passing fields and cities, until he stepped off in Cape May, unsteady on his feet, but sure enough to walk to the address he remembered from that old photograph. He described arriving at her shop door, trembling, silent, and then finding the courage to knock. Without interruption, Thomas continued. He confessed that while he repaired the fabric stands and restocked shelves, he was trying to weave himself back into an existence that belonged to them both. He said he arranged the letters and mementos in the little back room so they could face their past together. He wrote new letters, unknown to Eliza, expressing his fear that she would reject him, his shame over the lost years, and his hope that they could begin again, however slowly. Eliza felt tears threaten again, but held them at bay. She felt the weight of both their histories, her memory of longing, his memory of wandering, in the small silence between them. She realized that he was no longer just the man who had returned, but a person transformed, carrying loss and survival in his bearing, whose presence now presented her with both comfort and questions she had never fully dared to ask. Outside, the harbor seemed to breathe with gentle calm. The fishermen returned with nets glistening, gulls circled overhead, and inside the shop, the hum of routine resumed. But Eliza and Thomas carried within them an undercurrent of change. He brought stories of places she would never visit, and she carried the harbor where she waited. Their connection began to root in a shared present, but also in the parallel lives they once led separately. As twilight fell one evening, Eliza placed 2 cups of tea on the rear room table, and after a pause said, "Thomas, if you stay, I want you to know something. I kept your memory alive, and tonight, I wonder if I should have waited even harder." He lifted her hand and gently kissed her knuckles. "You waited just long enough," he said softly. In the days to come, Eliza discovered a letter Thomas had written before returning, a letter he never sent, begun under a mosquito net in a remote harbor. "If I cannot prove my name, then let my actions speak. Let my steps bring me closer. Let me live by the hope you still held." She read it aloud in the back room, her voice breaking, while he watched the play of candlelight across her face. For a moment, the world narrowed to those words, bridging silence and return. Neighbors stopped commenting on the saga of a lost sailor and instead began asking about the shop's patterns, the quality of wool, and whether new shutters would arrive by holiday. Thomas greeted them politely. Eliza noticed she began to laugh again, softly, truly, when he joked about a too-wide drapery or helped a customer pick out thread colors, their routines knitted together in plain daylight, evidence of living present, not just grief past. One afternoon, Clara visited again and said to Eliza, "He's trying to build something new, not relive the past." Later, she pulled Thomas aside and whispered, "I see you doing it, brother." He nodded, taking her hand, as if reaffirming his choice not to hide in shame, but to grow in existence. Eliza found herself writing replies to his old letters, not to send, but to write. She wrote, "I still wonder how the sea feels without you there, but at least it led you back." She slipped these pages between bolts of fabric and dusted them with salt from the window. Thomas found them over days and carefully placed them in his sea-worn trunk. Each note, each gesture became another stitch in their joint reconstruction. On nights when Cape May slept under a hush of moonlight, Eliza and Thomas walked along the boardwalk, leaning close against the whisper of waves and the quiet hush of lamps. He said, "I wanted to give you everything, my return, my regrets, my letters, but I know now that only my presence matters." She nodded and leaned her head on his shoulder. They watched the harbor lights reflect on black water, and the unsaid promise between them felt stronger than any spoken vow. Their relationship was not salvaged with declarations. It was built through waiting, presence, and everyday faith. They did not reclaim the lost years, but they created a new chapter, quiet and honest, shaped by two lives that had converged again, one once adrift, one kept anchor. The shop became their sanctuary, the sea their witness. One evening, when the sky above Cape May glowed in soft twilight and gentle breeze rustled through the Victorian shutters, Eliza and Thomas sat together on the weathered bench outside the shop, looking out toward the lighthouse and the quiet harbor where the sea's rhythm had once driven them apart and now held them in shared presence. The town's street lamps flickered on, casting amber halos around them, and in the fading light, everything felt suspended in calm, neither memory nor fear, but a fragile trust that had begun to take root. They returned inside the shop, and Eliza guided Thomas to the rear room, where a single brass lamp cast a golden glow across worn wooden floorboards. There, among unopened letters and collected keepsakes, shells, old photographs, a metal compass etched with his initials, sat the second half of a story now being rewritten. He pulled out fresh stationery and ink, hands steady now, and began drafting a letter addressed to those silent futures they had both feared. "I carry her memory in every step," he wrote, "and I intend to live each day so those words are meaningful again." While Thomas wrote, Eliza folded a bolt of fabric, her movements rhythmic, meditative, as though stitching time with quiet acceptance. She paused when she heard the scratch of pen finishing a sentence. Thomas looked up and met her gaze. Between them unfolded the unspoken understanding that the letter was not for mailing, it was an anchor. She crossed the distance and placed her hand over his. In that room, shadows and light mingled around them, echoing their shared journey from loss toward something like home. Morning came cold and overcast, and they prepared the shop together, Eliza measuring fabric by the window, Thomas arranging jars of thread and candle tins. By the afternoon, they shared conversations about Cape May's history, about the old World War II lookout tower, still standing at Sunset Beach as a tribute to local veterans, and about the VFW Post downtown, which hosted events and preserved stories of those who, like Thomas, had returned from distant waters. That evening, they attended a small gathering at the American Legion down the boardwalk. The hall was decorated with vintage flags and poppy wreaths, reminders of sacrifice and solidarity. Clara and Eliza's friend Helene joined them. Both watched Thomas greet other veterans with quiet respect. He stood among them, not as a stranger claiming a past, but as a man steadily rebuilding, offering his presence, his silence, his invitation to trust. Eliza stood beside him, feeling that their return was unfolding not on stage, but in the humility of everyday humanity. The next day, inside the shop, Eliza discovered several small notes tucked between fabric bolts. "I'm still learning how to come home. Will you keep me if I forget again?" Each in Thomas's handwriting. She read them by the afternoon sun, fingers tracing his cursive. Tears glistened in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from recognition. He was committed not just to returning, but to staying. Then came a quiet Saturday evening, when the two closed the shop early and walked along the dunes toward the old World War II tower overlooking Delaware Bay. Atop the dunes, the wind carried seabirds overhead. They climbed the worn stairwell inside the tower, stopping at each landing to read plaques honoring local servicemen, Cape May citizens who had gone to war and returned, or not returned, names etched on a wall of service and memory. They reached the viewing gallery at the top and looked out over water, now peaceful under the setting sun. Thomas turned to Eliza. "I was trained to watch ships from towers like this," he said softly, eyes on the horizon. "But it was staring out at the sea that made me realize the distance isn't the thing I feared most. It was what I might leave behind." She nodded, her hair lifted by the wind, and he slipped an arm around her. They stood together, a quiet silhouette against the open sea, the town's distant lights blinking awake. Back home, they found the shop lighted softly. Thomas carried inside a small jar of local Cape May diamonds, quartz pebbles found on the beach. He placed the jar beside Eliza's unopened letters and said quietly, "May these be the first of many reasons to collect something we share." She smiled and kissed his cheek. In the week that followed, their routine deepened, morning coffee, folding fabric, walking the beach at dawn, writing new letters at the desk. On one night, Eliza read aloud one of Thomas's newly written letters. "I do not know what tomorrow brings, but tonight I know you are here." She folded the letter and placed it in his chest. He nodded, understanding the vow it carried. Neighbors noticed the change. The shop felt warm, alive. The quiet sadness had lifted. When someone asked about fabric for holiday orders, Thomas answered with calm assurance. Eliza realized she laughed more easily again, small, soft laughs, not from relief, but from belonging. One woman commented, "There's something different in here now." Eliza turned to Thomas and whispered, "We built that." That Sunday, a veteran recognition ceremony took place at the old lookout tower. Eliza and Thomas attended. Veterans wearing lapel pins saluted. Local children laid poppies, and the town's mayor spoke of honor and memory. Thomas listened, hands folded. Later, Eliza watched him quietly place a single shell from his chest at the foot of the stone monument, a private tribute. He whispered, "For those who couldn't come home." She stood beside him, tears in her eyes. That night, cedar lights glowed in the kitchen upstairs, and they made tea. Thomas read aloud from one of his early letters, the one that said, "I thought I'd lost you." Eliza touched his hand, "But you didn't." They sat in silence, the hum of the town below, the sea beyond. Their lives did not become a fairy tale. Instead, they became a softer story about two people who had lost time, but not each other. Their love continued not in grand gestures, but in quiet affirmations, a handwritten note, a shared cup of tea, a walk by the water. The sea that once separated them now witnessed their togetherness. Eliza Carter stood at the shop window early one morning, watching the sea beyond the wooden pier, its surface calm and infinite, as if waiting for something she could not yet name. And she felt a shift. She was no longer living with absence, but with presence. The woman who preserved a letter of promise, now sharing life with the man who returned to fulfill it, even if self-consciously and without ceremony. Inside the shop, the air smelled of fresh fabric and the salt breeze. She tucked a bolt of turquoise cloth into place, while Thomas carefully arranged newly purchased thread spools and vintage buttons on the display. Customers chatted inside, but the real transformation unfolded quietly. In the steady rhythm of shared tasks, they reclaimed days once lost. There were no grand gestures, only deliberate, ordinary acts, lifting boxes, greeting neighbors, sorting ribbons that signaled belonging. Later that afternoon, they paused behind the counter. Eliza offered him a cup of tea in a simple china cup. He accepted gently and said, "I want to be useful." She looked at him, heart full, and replied, "You already are." His gaze caught hers, and in that brief meeting they sealed an unspoken agreement that return is only the beginning and presence is the promise. A few days later, Thomas found an old wooden postcard holder in the back room. Inside, he placed cards from Cape May, scenic views, snapshots of him and Eliza, images of their coastline, alongside the shells and letters. Each card was a small, quiet declaration. He intended to stay, piece by piece, memory by memory. When Eliza discovered the collection, she whispered, "You're weaving us into this town." He nodded, folding his fingers around hers. One evening, they took their routine walk along the beach dunes. The sun dipped in orange brilliance beyond sea glass and driftwood. Eliza paused and looked back at the shop, lit in the distance, and said, "If someone asked me about Thomas Walker now, I'd say he came home." He smiled softly, brushing sand from her coat, and she rested her head on his shoulder. And just then, she knew they had moved from waiting into belonging. In the week that followed, neighbors spoke kindly, not with curiosity but with warmth, about the shop. They asked how the winter collection looked and if new colors would arrive by the holidays. Thomas responded with steady confidence, and Eliza laughed, a small, clear sound of joy, when he teased a customer about a shade too vivid. Their tasks, once marked by solitude, now pulsed with companionship. That Saturday evening, Cape May hosted a small veteran event at the Lighthouse Tower. Eliza and Thomas attended. The gathering was humble, a few flags, a moment of silence, and local veterans sharing stories in low conversation. Afterwards, Thomas walked alone to the tower's base and placed a small shell by the memorial plaque, one of the pebbles he carried across the sea. Eliza watched from nearby, tears glinting as he whispered, "For those who never returned." She stepped beside him, reached for his hand, and held it with quiet pride. Back in their home above the shop, cedar lights glowed in the kitchen. Eliza prepared tea. Thomas read aloud from one of his old letters. "I feared my absence would erase you." She touched his hand on the table and replied gently, "But your return wrote us anew." They sat in silence, the hum of the town drifting through the open window, the ocean's pulse soft on the rooftop. No wedding, no public vows, no promise of forever. Yet what remained was stronger than any ceremony. Two lives recommitted through quiet perseverance, shared daily rituals and letters written to connect rather than to mend. Their love unfolded not with fanfare, but with enduring, simple truth. As the sun rose the next morning, Eliza stood by the window with a spool of thread and a card Thomas had placed beside it. "Today, let's just be here." She picked it up and tucked it into her coat pocket before opening the door to welcome customers. Thomas joined her by the counter. Together, they looked out toward the sea, woven into the rhythm of Cape May's gentle tides, grounded in presence, anchored in memory, yet moving forward. Their story did not end. It continued in light touches, shared tasks, and the steady heartbeat of daily life. Their return was not an arrival, it was a beginning. We share new stories every day, true tales that move, inspire, and stay with you. If this one touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.